Welcome to this new episode of the PDY podcast, which is hosted by the ECPR in the series Political Science Matters. I am Michelangelo Vercesi, and I work at the University of Naples, Federico II, and I'm one of the editors of the European Journal of Political Research, Political Data Yearbook. In this new talk, we are going to discuss the results and outlooks of the election for the renewal of the Bundestag, the German first chamber, which was held on Sunday, February 23rd, 2025. The election told us in a nutshell that Incumbent Traffic Light lost its majority, with the main party, the party of the Chancellor, of the outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz, so the Social Democrats, suffered from a loss of about 9% of votes. The Greens lost about 3%, and the junior coalition partner, the Liberals, did not pass the threshold of 5% to enter the parliament for a few votes, losing 7% of votes. It is also worth recalling that early elections were called after the cabinet fell due to internal coalition conflict. And if we look at the other side, the conservative CDU, so the Christian Democrats, the conservative Christian Democrats, in alliance with Bavarian Christian Social Union, led by candidates to Chancellor Friedrich Merz, won the election with about 29%, gaining more than 4% relative to 2021. However, the most consistent increase of vote is that of the far-right populist party AfD, so Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, which doubled the results of 2021 and reached 21% of votes. On the left, the Link entered the parliament with almost 9% of votes, while the alliance of the ex-Link member Sarah Wagenknecht did not make it for a few votes. These numbers, if we look at them, already anticipate difficult coalition talks, at least because they imply that parties from different sides have to form a coalition. And I'm particularly happy to discuss these results and outlooks with a very renewed expert of German politics, German political system, and elections in Germany, whose insights will definitely help clarify key aspects of these elections well beyond Germany. So I'm very happy to welcome Professor Thorsten Faas, who is Professor for Political Science at the Freie Universität Berlin and head of the Center for Political Sociology of Germany at that university. Hi, Thorsten. Hello, welcome.
Hi, very good to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks to you for being with us and for accepting the invitation. So it's a great pleasure. I would start with trying to understand the reasons behind this quite substantial level of electoral volatility, so changes in party support. As said, the parties in government had a bad performance, in particular the SPD, so the Social Democrats, SPD, which moved from being the first party to being the third largest party. How would you explain this volatility? Do you think, for example, that government policy performance or electoral manifestos played a role? Or do you see that voters mostly punished internal disagreements? Or maybe it's also due to the high electoral turnout of 84% this time?
That's quite a difficult question, but I try to do my best to answer it. And let me stress the last point you mentioned. We had an extremely high turnout. I mean, for a country where there is no formal duty to vote, a turnout rate of almost 83% is quite remarkable. We had these rates in the past already. We even had more than 90% turnout in the 70s. But compared to the most recent federal elections, where we had seen turnout rates of 75 plus or minus, this has been quite remarkable, and it shows that this really has been an extraordinary election. Usually German elections take place every 4 years, sticking to the cliche that usually really is the case in Germany, that we stick to these fixed parliamentary terms. The last early elections we had was almost 20 years ago. Before that, another 20 years. So it's really the case that normally these legislative terms are stable, they're 4 years long, and that this time around it was not the case, really shows that's been an extraordinary, or that we have extraordinary times, and the early election is quite an exception to the normal rule. I'm saying this because the coalition actually wasn't able to finish the term, but that rather than broke up in November 24. is also a thing we are not used to. And this traffic light coalition, we never had that before. Social Democrats, Greens, and the Liberals. It's not only the fact that we never had it before, but a coalition that actually spans across blocks, so to say, that there are two rather left parties, Social Democrats and Greens on the left-hand side rather, and then the Liberals on the right-hand side, at least in economic terms. They had to form a coalition after the 21 election, and they were quite happy to do so. They gave themselves the label of a progress coalition because they share a lot of policy positions on kind of the rather cultural dimension. But right after the war broke out, Russia attacked Ukraine. It wasn't about cultural things, but it was really about hard economic questions. It was about energy supply, inflation, debt regulations. And in that direction, on that dimension, the parties really didn't have a common ground, and there were ever increasing tensions in the coalition, and the approval ratings for the coalition really were at historic lows. At some point in time, then the three parties, initiated probably by the Liberals, decided to stop, to end that coalition. You mentioned that in your introduction, but that shows it's been an extraordinary election. And what this extraordinary election means is that people kind of had to reorient themselves. So there was a perception that it's a really important election, the February one that we just had. But at the same time, people could no longer rely maybe on heuristics, on those things that they are used to. And so there were a lot of late deciding voters, a lot of uncertainty, but ultimately people made up their mind and made new choices. A lot of them at least did. So that's, I guess, the main driver for volatility. One more thing, we have to keep in mind that in the 2021 election, the Social Democrats back then really had a significant last-minute swing. So they ended up at 25% back then, but just 2 months ahead of the election, they were actually polling at about 16, 17% back then. So actually the share of votes they received right now, and there was an expectation that they might be able to have this last-minute momentum yet again, but this time it didn't happen at all, and they ultimately ended up at this historic low for them of actually just 16.5%.
Oh, okay. I mean, this clarifies a lot. I mean, okay, so moving to the AfD or the Linke, so the left and the right of the sides of these two parties, in the light of what you have just mentioned, I think it's clear that German citizens radicalized their vote to some extent by voting in 1/5 for the far-right AfD, but also increasing the support for the left, so the Linke. And moreover, the AfD is the first party in most of the territories of the former German Democratic Republic, while the CDU is the first party in most of the constituencies of the former Federal Republic, which is, I think, a further sign of division. So what are the main factors, for example, social, economic, culture, that may account for this shift? What are the main demands of these electorates? Do you see that a long-term polarization is affecting the German political system towards the two extremes, which may also radicalize the positioning of the two Volksparteien, so the SPD and the CDU?
Well, the German electorate has become much more diverse or heterogeneous in over recent years, and we clearly see quite significant differences in voting behavior these days with respect to former East versus West Germany. But that's only part of the story, actually. I mean, if you look at urban areas in contrast to rather rural areas, that applies to East and West. You see significant differences. The Greens, but also the Left Party, they do much better in urban university cities, for example, compared to rural areas where the AfD is actually on the rise in East Germany, but also in West Germany. They were actually hoping, from their perspective, to win constituencies in West Germany. They ultimately weren't able to do so, but they're almost there. Next time around, 29 possibly, also win constituencies in West Germany. So it's not only an East versus West story here, but it's really more, as we see in other countries, tremendous differences between place of living, basically, but there are also considerable age differences. The left, for example, did very, very well among young people, also the AfD. But if you look at exit poll data, actually the left came in first place among voters aged 30 or less, or 29 or less. And that also shows that the left was able to kind of attract the vote of progressive voters that were frustrated with the traffic light coalition in general, but also Social Democrats and Greens in the traffic light coalition, whereas the left party was kind of the clean alternative for these voters, having positions with respect to migration that were quite different compared to other parties. And we have to keep in mind that migration, even though the debate wasn't very specific and many times also not very much based on facts, but it still dominated the campaign very much. Immigration, but also kind of integration of people living here already. We've had quite dramatic attacks in the course of the campaign, terrorist attacks that gave even more importance to the issue of migration. So a lot of the campaign was focusing on questions of migration. That, in a way, is, you could almost say, a classic topic that helps right-wing radical parties. But the left party was really the only one that offered a different position on migration issues. So in a way, they also benefited from the debate about migration and all that was related to it. People's parties, the Volkspartei and the catch-all parties, they really are still doing very well among old voters, but you hardly see them as large parties among younger voters. We basically see a lot of parties at 10, 15, 20% among young voters. And I think that's actually the future of German politics here, that we don't have these large parties with whom or with which voters have stable party identifications, but it has become, and it will remain, I guess, a very volatile system with significant changes in short but also midterm perspectives, given the really tremendous disapproval for the work and the people also of the traffic light coalition, combined with the fact you mentioned Friedrich Merz, the most likely next Chancellor of Germany. His approval ratings are actually also rather poor. So you have rather low approval ratings for the center of politics, and I guess that also makes it easier for people to vote for options that are more on the extreme of the political spectrum.
Yeah, the picture looks more complex and less straightforward than one could think at the first sight. Okay, so far we have talked about the factors that can make sense of the results of this election. But given these differences between parties, I guess that the results and this election will be also consequential for policy in Germany, both internal policy and foreign policy. So sticking to the first issue, I would like to hear your opinion about this. How do you see the upcoming coalition talks and government formation process? And how do you think that voters will react to a new Große Koalition, so a new grand coalition, which seems the most likely outcome?
There was a lot of speculation in the run-up to election day, which coalitions would be mathematically possible and also politically feasible after election day. Actually, we have a much clearer picture now, because mathematically there are other options, but actually, when you think about it in terms of math and politics, it's quite obvious that the only viable majority coalition really is a coalition of Christian Democrats and Social Democrats. Mathematically, I should say that once here very clearly, mathematically, a coalition of Christian Democrats and the Alternative for Germany is there. They would have quite a stable or quite a large majority, maybe not stable, but large in parliament, but it has been ruled out in the run-up to the campaign by Friedrich Merz and the social and the Christian Democrats. So I don't expect that there will be not even talks for such a coalition. It has been ruled out so clearly, so unmistakably, that I really don't think that this will pop up even as a kind of a vague option. So actually, the only majority coalition that is left is a coalition of Christian Democrats and Social Democrats. The Greens or the combined vote share of Christian Democrats and Greens is too small. That's not enough to have a stable coalition, a majority coalition. And we don't have a tradition in Germany of having oversized coalitions. So there's no need for, when you think of a coalition of Christian and Social Democrats, there's no need for an additional Green Party, for example. So we are really set for yet another coalition of Christian and Social Democrats. We're still used to label that the Große Koalition, the Grand Coalition, although there's some talk now that maybe we need a different label for that, because if you combine their vote shares, it's just 45% actually in terms of votes. It's slightly more in terms of parliamentary seats because of the electoral threshold we have. But still, it's not a huge majority actually that they have. It's a stable one, and then once they agree, they'll be fine in that sense. But it's not really a grand coalition. And we have to keep in mind Social Democrats came in third place. So it's not even a coalition of the two biggest parties, because the AfD is significantly larger than the Social Democrats. It's not an easy one, actually. The experiences we have had with so-called grand coalitions are that they somehow work quite smoothly, quite professionally, but at the same time, thinking back of the grand coalitions led by Angela Merkel, there was not a lot of debate or dispute or discussion about policies. Some argue that this is one of the reasons why populist parties could actually emerge, because they articulated certain positions that weren't talked about in the time in the era of the grand coalition of the Große Koalition. One thing, the other thing is, with respect to some policy dimensions, they're quite far apart actually, and probably even further apart, Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, as the parties of the traffic light coalition were. I mean, as I said, they labeled themselves the progressive coalition because they would share a lot of policy positions on cultural dimensions. Liberals, Greens, and Social Democrats, I mean, they're typically seen as progressive parties. Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, I mean, they're on different side of the dimensions with respect to economic issues, but also cultural issues. So they're really, in a way, even further apart. They have this tradition of finding compromises and being able to work together, but still, in terms of policy change and to what extent will Germany be different in the future than it is now, I don't know how much room for maneuver there actually is, or whether it be rather small shifts here and there. With respect to foreign policy, I think they are quite close to each other actually in that dimension. And with respect to Europe, with respect to Ukraine, there's not a lot of difference between these two parties. I mean, they've been the parties that have the chancellorship in Germany. And so they, in that sense, they really are parties that, again, have maybe whatever that is, but have a national interest in mind and share quite similar positions with respect to foreign policy. So don't expect too much change with respect to foreign policy for the next German government to come.
Just jump in regarding foreign policy. You say that one should not expect too much change in terms of foreign policy, but what about, for example, the relationship, the prospects of the relationship with Donald Trump and the administration of Donald Trump? Do you think that Friedrich Merz is going to have a friendly relationship or a hard relationship?
Well, actually, the first really strong signals from the new Trump administration with respect to Europe, NATO, but also especially Ukraine, just reached Germany a few days before the election, and you could sense that really made a difference. I mean, before that, Friedrich Merz would actually oftentimes blame the chancellor for not taking care enough of the kind of Germany-US relationship, not being ready for talking to Donald Trump. And he, as the chancellor, would act in a very different way. I mean, as a person, given his career, he's always been, Friedrich Merz, been very interested in transatlantic relationships. So he really has quite strong networks to the US. But German politics as a whole, including the Christian Democrats, including Friedrich Merz, were really shocked by these dramatic changes in foreign policy by the Trump administration. And so what Friedrich Merz says now is quite different to what he said before that. And he'd be more friendly or more open to a Trump administration. It sounds very different these days. That it's quite clear that Germany will have to increase spending with respect to defense policy. the future of Ukraine and the role Germany will play there is an open question that's not really been discussed so far in the campaign, but that will probably be on the agenda right now. So, but again, I would argue that this is something that both parties share, that they realize there are new challenges coming up, huge challenges, and they have to find ways to solve these. That actually also puts some pressure on the timing of the coalition talks. I mean, there are no formal rulings for that. It's basically a chaotic period. We don't have like the Austrian system, a formateur or things like that. So it's really up to the parties how they organize the process. Friedrich Merz has said that a kind of Easter is the target he has for the new government, but there's no rule for that. So we really will have to see how long it will take and what ultimately the result of the coalition talks will be.
Thank you so much, Torsten, for this very interesting talk and for providing us with most valuable insights about the 2025 German elections and for your time for the podcast.
It's really been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
This was the ECPR Political Data Yearbooks podcast. Goodbye and until the next episode.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.